Honorable colleagues, dear friends, it's such a pleasure to be among you again here at the Central European University. Thank you very much for inviting me, for giving me the opportunity to take part in the work of this Professors Network Group. So our research is demanding, such is the topic. I guess it's clear after Professor Varga's speech that it is so. At least it is clearer to me. So it is interesting also, it is important, but it is confusing and it is complicated. So I try to give a few very broad remarks on federalism, on separation of powers, on checks and balances in a comparative perspective. At the very beginning of the creation of United States as the first modern constitutional democracy, Publius, which is here most probably James Madison, in Federalist Paper number 51, reminded of difficulties in framing the government which is to be administered by men over men. So you must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place oblige it to control itself. Madison emphasizes that American Constitution resolves that particular problem by using measures of auxiliary precautions. The horizontal separation of powers represents main constitutional precautionary measure. National government is divided in three branches: executive, legislative, and judicial. Each branch of government is given power to check on the other two branches. Systems of checks and balances is applied so that no branch of power is more powerful than another. Further constitutional precautionary measure is vertical separation of powers, or federalism. Here, the separation of powers refers to the arrangement between the national or federal government and state governments. So the Constitution removes numerous obstacles as it regards governing of nation, and auxiliary precautions serve to protect the rights of citizens. Now, 170 years after the historical example of the United States, which in 1787 adopted constitution with separation of power and federalism as auxiliary precautions against abuse of power, representatives of 6 European countries, similar to American founding fathers, committed to creation of an ever closer union among the nations of the peoples of Europe. With the adoption of the Treaty of Rome, that opens up the perspective of common development of European states, construction and realization of the project of European constitutionalism begins, which in the decades that followed expressed all the unique complexity of its nature. Now, it is to be assumed that the architects of the EU were aware of possible abuses of power in one such new and supranational model of integration and regulation. The migration of constitutional ideas of course, was not an unknown phenomena, but it was also known that it was complex and contentious process, so both in empirical and in normative terms. Nevertheless, the possibility of comparing these two historical endeavors of the US and the EU proved to be useful in many ways. In the US, Madison used precautions, in other words, federal separation of powers and different mechanisms of checks and balances, against the concentration of powers in the hands of the legislative body. In the supranational European context, the situation was quite different, so different ideas began their specific life and application. In any case, migration of constitutional ideas found fertile ground in this area as well. The example of the constitution making of the founding fathers from the beginning shows all the important reasons for the necessary rationalization and application of forms of preventive constitutionalism, by which Vermeulen refers to preventive principles of constitutionalism, which are attempts to guard against or even minimize particular political risks, such as the abuse of power or tyranny, particularly feared in the founding period. Now, in that sense, the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia and the US Constitution presented results of long discussions on how to create such a government that will be controlled by itself. American founding fathers have been designing exhaustively and for a long time how to separate power between three branches of federal government. They have carefully studied numerous checks and balances that could govern the mutual relations among the different branches. And because of these efforts, the Constitution they ultimately presented to the American people included a wide variety of mechanisms to protect people's liberties, including the set of famous auxiliary precautionary measures. Now, the time in which similarities in the constitutional development between American and European institutions were emphasized was later replaced by some other remarks. With time, especially after the collapse of socialist regimes in Central and Eastern Europe, European constitutional theory and practice is becoming aware that it has developed certain characteristics different from US constitutionalism and vice versa. Development of European integration, creation of numerous and diverse institutions, both on European as well as on national levels, their inevitable influence on each other, dialogue, harmonization, it all opened up the possibility of discovering a particular European constitutionalism. Although critical analysis on the EU emphasized that simple transplanting of constitutional rule narrative in supranational context is not exactly natural, and that the EU cannot be simply contextualized using constitutional concepts, the EU constitutionalization process was, from the beginning, related to certain classic ideas. In the process of development of the EU as an innovative, sui generis political and economic union of states, the forms of what Vermeulen called instruments of preventing constitutionalism, namely federalism, separation of powers, will be and were and will be shaped, modified and applied in special way. This means that European constitutionalism, if it desires to have and to nurture a prudent attitude towards citizens, should be understood as a policy that will follow medicine's path and compensate for the lack of better motives with opposing and competing interests. And the consequence of this is that the tested and rationally built EU constitutional framework must not only enable the government to control the governed, but also to equally support and realize all known as well as new auxiliary precautionary measures and checks and balances within the government itself. So in this sense, the separation of powers and federalism are precautionary measures that every good government should take into account, including the one in the EU. Starting with the adoption of American Federal Constitution, the state and legal system in the US rests on these pillars. Although in the long process of acceptance, opposition, and adaptation to new times and changed circumstances, these two principles were exposed to great challenges. They never lost their quality as guardians of democratic republic. Of course, a lot has changed since the emergence of the first democratic constitutional republics in 18th century until today. The reality of modern constitutional democracies shows that actually the separation of powers has always been marked by the dominance of one branch, whatever it was. In the United States, for example, every branch of government has been imperial at some time in some particular period. So it was discussed about imperial presidency, imperial Congress, of course, imperial court. In fact, already during the heroic age of constitutionalism, the interaction of political ideas and practical issues of organization of government revealed a series of imperfections in the separation of powers doctrine. But fundamental concept of the founding fathers, the idea of limited government, or in other words, constitutionalism, remained to serve the purpose of creating good government. After the American and French revolutions, which generally determined the development of state and society in direction of democratization, the modern era could rightly be labeled as the time of triumph of constitutionalism. Its foundations, its fundamental components, were still separation of powers and checks and balances. Though not perfect, moreover, they were often source of folly and frustration, they became permanent and important characteristics of new states. Now, federalism and separation of powers have in common the division of power in vertical and horizontal sense. in order to prevent the accumulation of excessive power at any level. Federalism restrains government by creating two sovereign competencies, which limits the influence of both, while the separation of powers as complex of norms that includes, among other, the principle of checks and balances, imposes internal limits on the government itself. In second half of the 20th century, constitutionalism moves from its traditional environment, which is national state, into transnational or global frameworks. So here, new transnational dimension of constitutionalism is triggered by simultaneous internationalization and constitutionalization of international law. The application of constitutional principles in the international legal order is therefore required, as it is their adaptation. Now, constitutionalism is and should also be of importance for the European Union. If its elements are incorporated into the description of everything in the EU, and Joseph Weiler wrote that constitutionalism is DOS or Windows of the European community then, a reasonable conclusion would be that new transnational constitutionalism as a mixtus compositum contains its traditional elements in addition to some new characteristics. Such elements that are connected with constitutional order include, for example, the hierarchical organization of norms, the authority to produce binding rules, direct applicability, etc., etc. In a nutshell, the claim is that institutions which replicate the features associated with constitutional orders should be considered in constitutional terms. To borrow Alex Sweet Stone's colorful metaphor, if it looks, walks, and quacks like a duck, then it is probably a duck. Now, the complex phenomenon of multi-level governance imposed on the theory by the issue of European integration, especially the question of democratic deficit that accompanies the practice of complex multi-level governance structures, led to more attention being paid to the topic of understanding democracy at European level, as well as to the need of its protection. In this context, there was now also natural revival of well-known James Madison's arguments. This neo-Madisonian vision highlighting that the EU institutions must rely on two democracy principles advocated by Madison: the separation of powers and the system of checks and balances. But from the very beginning of the EU, the reality of the connection of this community with theory and practice of separation of powers principle was rejected by many. This was witnessed by numerous opinions that such complex is simply not applicable to the EU system. Negative views were especially dominant in the initial years of European integration and development of its institutions, when the division of power was interpreted in a strictly American way. However, since the logic of the separation of powers as a principle that guarantees values of constitutional democracy opened wide, especially at the moment when former socialist countries started with the process of democratization and their accession to European integration, neither the European Union could remain indifferent to the imperatives flowing from this principle in relation to structuring of its own constitutional system of exercise of public authority. So, as a credible project of supranational government, if it wants to be like that, the European Union is then bound to achieve the highest standards of constitutionalism. So, the inspirational phrase of federalism in American context is definitely a phrase more perfect union, a kind of open sesame of American constitutionalism, magical words that inspired generations of Americans. Similar phrase used in the EU context, which is ever closer union, was, however, and still is, the source of numerous polarizations and disagreement regarding the path of the European countries, or regarding the path European countries should take. Now, the question of genuine meaning and character of the community, of the Union, follows the EU from the beginning. and of course this complicates our quest. It also, in this sense, reminded of Samuel Pufendorf's 1667 treatise that described the Roman-German Empire as a monster, as an irregular state, irregulare corpus, because it represented neither monarchy, neither a confederation of states. Of course, that book raised an uproar throughout Germany. It was quickly banned from the university. The writer was condemned, and that's how it goes. But evident prudence in the search for a strict definition of the political legal character of the European Association of States, caution in defining relations of central institutions with the member states of the alliance, which was born at the very beginning, follow the European Union until today. It is therefore not surprising that from time to time the intellectual search for figuring out its nature ends in comparison with platypus, that strange animal. So, let us remind that the essence of preventive constitutionalism is the advocacy and defense of rules and structures as precautionary measures and procedures against the risk of abuse of power by acting officials or other constitutional actors, against the risk of tyrannical majority or other political pathologies. In the set of several different forms, the Federalist principle of caution has a special significance. Was it precisely this point of view that inspired the understanding of member states as masters of the treaties? I believe that this is so because this precautionary principle advocates strict control of competences of central federal institutions. So at the beginning of the 19th century, it was George Tucker who urged that the Constitution is to be construed strictly in all cases where the antecedent rights of a state may be drawn in question. This is so-called Tucker's rule, based on consent theory and precautionary measures. Reality, therefore, points us towards a compromise, towards such understanding of federalism that would be broader than classic American model, yet narrower, more principled than multi-level management approach. Such an attitude, such approach identifies minimum of institutional and procedural elements that are essential for the qualification of a system, maybe as a federal, but without excluding different combinations. So it has to include combinations such as existential guarantees that protect the rights of all constituent members, the mechanism of negotiation and compromise based on the equality of members, etc. Now, when the Treaty of the EU in 1992 constitutionalized the principle of subsidiarity, making it general constitutional principle, the European federalism finally gained a constitutional principle whose exclusive task was nothing more than to protect the member states from the danger of excessive centralization. As argued, for example, by Robert Schutze, the central authority should have a subsidiary function in the sense that it performs only those tasks that cannot be realized on a more immediate or local level, and with the aim of achieving unity through the harmonious arrangement of several objectives. Having in mind cooperation as concept, having in mind cooperation as arrangement, such arrangement that would benefit both levels, the Union and the Member States, trying to reconcile these two main notions of our conference, of our topic, federalism and coexistence, I realized, reading and writing the article, that Carl J. Friedrich wrote about these two opposed aspirations. In his words, one is striving towards diversity and the other is striving towards unity. It will be shown that coexistence is possible and that federal order has a future only when these two aspirations penetrate each other. Finding proper balance, of course, however, remains the key question. Thank you.